This week's story is about rising above adversity, about defying fate itself. Sometimes, all we need is a spark to break through. In the suburbs of Melbourne, Australia, on a December morning in 1982, a child was born. No one in the hospital room said a word. Not because they were overwhelmed with joy, but because they were too shocked to speak. The baby, a boy, was born without arms. Without legs. There had been no warning signs from ultrasounds, no advance notice from doctors. His mother fainted. His father, a strong and stern man, walked out of the room and punched the hospital wall. Nick Vujicic was born with tetraamelia syndrome, a rare disorder that prevents the development of limbs. But more painful than the physical condition was the silence that greeted his birth. No newborn cries. No cheers of joy. Just a cold, aching stillness that gripped his young mother's heart. From an early age, Nick was a question mark in a world full of exclamation points. While other children learned to hold their parents' hands, he learned to balance on his round torso. While other kids threw balls, climbed trees, and rode skateboards, he could only roll across the floor, using a tiny foot, about the size of a finger, growing from his left hip to control everything. People looked at him with pity. Some avoided him altogether. But worse than that were the kids at school, kids who didn't hesitate to laugh, whisper, or even say it out loud. That freak doesn't have any arms. He must be from another planet. Maybe his mom didn't want him to be born. Nick heard it all. Remembered it all. Not because he was weak, but because he couldn't not hear. Couldn't not remember. Couldn't stop wondering why he was even here. His parents, though heartbroken and overwhelmed, decided to send him to school. They didn't want their son locked away in the shadows. But sometimes, the light outside only deepened the cracks inside his heart. He once wished he hadn't been born. Wished he could trade anything just to have a normal body, to hold someone's hand, to stand on his own 2 feet. But the worst part wasn't the physical disability. It was the emotional fracture. It was the question he asked himself every single day. Does anyone in this world actually need me? At the age of 10, Nick decided he didn't want to live anymore. He locked himself in the bathroom, filled the tub with water, shut the door. He stared into the water, the one thing that didn't mock him, didn't turn its back on him, but also didn't give him any answers. He leaned over, preparing to slip beneath the surface. The cold brushed his cheek, touched his chest. And then, he stopped. In that single moment, Nick didn't hear anyone's voice. Not his mother crying. Not classmates laughing. Just one question, ringing clearly in his mind. If I die now, will I have left anything behind? No one knows how long he sat quietly in that bathroom. When he finally came out, his eyes were red, but his lips no longer trembled. Nick didn't take his life that day. But that didn't mean he had found a reason to live. It only meant he was still searching. Nick's teenage years were like walking a tightrope. On one side was the call to give up, and on the other, the faintest threads of hope. He began learning new skills, typing with 2 toes, dressing himself, rolling into bed, not because he believed he'd be normal, but just to prove to himself that he hadn't completely surrendered. But every night, when the world went quiet, Nick felt adrift. No hands to hold. No feet to walk. And no clear direction for who he was or where he belonged. He prayed often, though he didn't know who he was praying to. He listened often, though the only sound that came back was the echo of his own sadness. There was just one thing no one could take from him, the awareness that, I'm still here. Still breathing. Still feeling. Still alive. Nick entered adolescence like a man floating on a cracked wooden raft, drifting down the river of life without knowing where the shore was. His daily efforts, he once said, didn't make him feel stronger. They just exhausted him from trying to pretend he was okay. Every morning, he woke up and put on a smile like armor, his last shield against the growing fractures inside. In high school, he was taken to class in a wheelchair, sat in the back, always feeling like the exception in every story his classmates told. No one was cruel. But no one got close, either. So Nick began building a cage out of words. Whenever someone asked, "Do you need help?" he'd shake his head, "No, I'm fine." Whenever someone smiled, he'd smile back, then quickly look away, hiding the red in his eyes. Nick was a good student, but that didn't make him feel less alone. He could type 45 words per minute with 2 toes, could write full essays by himself, but at the end of the day, he still had to lie in bed alone, twisting his body for minutes just to pull a blanket over his shoulder, then staring at the ceiling in silence until morning came. One day, Nick asked his mother, "Mom, if I don't have arms or legs, what can I even do in life?" She didn't answer right away. She just looked into her son's eyes and quietly said, "Maybe not much, if that's what you believe." Then she walked away, leaving Nick alone with those words. It wasn't an answer, but maybe that's exactly why it stayed with him. He started wrestling with that question. Maybe he really couldn't do anything. No hands to write, no legs to walk, no body for anyone to admire, no strength to protect anyone. And if he had nothing to give, did he even deserve to exist? Nick was torn. He no longer wanted to die, but he didn't want to keep living the same way either. The early years of high school were a time of deep inner conflict, balancing between a fragile belief in himself and the undertow of shame. Some days he seemed hopeful, talking about wanting to work in tech someday. Other days, he sat in silence, staring into the mirror, wondering why God chose this body for him. Then, one day, a classmate opened up to Nick during recess. He talked about his own pain, his parents' divorce, feeling abandoned, hating himself. When he finished and waited for a reaction, Nick simply said, "I understand." Just 2 words. But the other boy's eyes welled up with tears. And something, tiny, but real, shifted inside Nick. For the first time, he didn't feel like just the object of pity. For the first time, someone had come to him, not to help, but to be heard. And through his own pain, Nick gave something that mattered. From that moment, an idea, vague but persistent, began to take root. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't a mistake of nature. Maybe it was because he had no arms and legs that he could understand the invisible pain others kept hidden. Still, those small flickers of hope were fragile. Because out in the real world, Nick still faced heartbreak. Once, he applied to join the school's tech club, only to be rejected because they thought he couldn't use the equipment. Another time, he wanted to speak at graduation, but was turned down because it might evoke negative emotions in other students. Nick didn't get angry. He just nodded and quietly stepped away, like he always did. But inside, he knew, he couldn't take much more. It was senior year. He sat alone in the library, surrounded by hundreds of books about success, strength, willpower, overcoming odds, all filled with images of muscular models, thriving businessmen, heroic athletes. None of them looked like him. None of them were disabled. None of them had to turn a page with a single toe. And Nick cried. There, in the library, he let the tears fall without hiding. Not because he was weak, but because he had been too strong for far too long, and no one ever saw it. He laid his head down on the table, shaking. And in those stifled sobs, a question broke through, like a blade cutting through every layer of defense. If I'm capable of loving someone else, then why can't I love myself? No one answered. But the question didn't leave. It stayed. Repeating. Softly. Patiently. And in that quiet persistence, something unexpected happened. Nick was used to rejection, to being looked at with pity, to loneliness so constant it felt like a second shadow. But what he wasn't used to, was being looked at without flinching. Without pity. Without curiosity. Just as a person. On that fateful day, Nick was 19. He had been invited to say a few words at a small youth church gathering, only about 10 people in the room. He didn't overthink it. Didn't prepare a fancy speech. Didn't expect anything remarkable. He simply shared his story, as raw and honest as it was. He talked about that night at age 10 in the bathroom. Talked about what it felt like when people turned away. Talked about the wounds no one could see, but that sometimes felt like they'd swallow his soul. Then he stopped. He didn't know what else to say. Silence. But not the cold silence he had known so well. This was warm. Deep. Waiting. A boy, maybe 13 or 14, from the back row walked up. He stepped toward Nick, hesitated, then knelt down and hugged the man with no arms, no legs, sitting on that small stage. Tears streamed down the boy's face. "Thank you," he whispered. "Because of you, for the first time, I think I can keep going." And just like that, Nick's world changed. For the first time, he no longer saw his disability as a burden. He saw it as a language, one only he could speak, to reach those who felt unreachable. And in that moment, something shattered inside him. Not pain, but the old limits he had placed on himself. From that one talk, Nick began receiving more invitations, small ones, a few people here and there. He wasn't paid. He wasn't famous. There was no media spotlight. But every time he shared his story, the eyes watching him told him one thing clearly. This is what I'm meant to do. Nick spent hours learning how to balance himself on stage, how to use his small foot to control presentation slides, how to drink water using his shoulder, all so he could speak to his audience as naturally as possible. Not to impress them, but so they would stop seeing him as a special case, and start seeing him as a regular person, with a heart that refuses to give up. An older woman once said after Nick's talk at a local school, "You reminded me of how strong I used to be, and how long I've forgotten that part of myself." Soon, Nick started getting invitations to go farther, other cities, other states. A teacher who heard him speak once sent a short video of him to an international youth organization. And then, something unimaginable happened. Nick was invited to California to speak at a large event, where hundreds of young people were waiting to hear something real. Standing on an American stage for the first time, Nick felt as though everything he'd been through, every pain, every moment of despair, was no longer something to hide. They were roadmaps. They were proof of transformation. He told his story with raw simplicity. No fancy words. No dramatic calls to action. Just presence. And the audience fell silent. Then erupted. The media started paying attention. Schools, churches, businesses, community organizations, they all wanted to invite Nick. They weren't looking for a perfect inspiration. They were looking for someone real, someone unashamed of who they were. Nick founded Life Without Limbs, a platform through which he could speak, share, and spread life's values to millions around the world. Each speech was different, but the core message never changed. Life isn't fair. But we define our lives by how we respond to it. He visited schools in South Africa, prisons in Brazil, disability centers in the Philippines, stadiums in Ukraine. And everywhere, he heard the same thing from the audience. "Thank you for showing me that I'm not invisible." People started asking, how can Nick inspire others when he's the one who's lost the most? And he would just smile. "I'm not trying to inspire anyone. I'm just being true to myself." And sometimes, the truth is more powerful than any miracle. And you know what? The most miraculous thing wasn't how far Nick had gone, how many people knew his name, or how many grand stages he stood on. The real miracle was that for the first time in his life, Nick himself began to believe in his own worth. But was that enough to keep his inner light burning forever? Or would there come a time, when even someone who had overcome their physical limits, would have to face deeper shadows within? The spotlight can make people forget the darkness that once swallowed them. But Nick never forgot. Because for him, light wasn't something others turned on for you. It was something you had to ignite from within. He had stood in front of tens of thousands, in New York, Tokyo, Nairobi. People cheered, stood up clapping, tears flowing. But after all of it, when the curtains closed, when the noise faded, Nick always returned to the one thing that had kept him going all these years, faith. Not blind faith. But a quiet, enduring faith that needed no proof. A belief that he was not worthless. That pain had a purpose. And that as long as he was alive, he could still give. Nick met Kane during a speaking event in Texas. She was a listener, a real listener. Not because he was special. Not because he was a speaker. But because in the way he told his story, she saw part of her own. Not the shiny part, but the part that had once fallen, and learned to rise. They fell in love, not through hand-holding, because Nick had no hands. They didn't go on walks like other couples, because he couldn't walk. But they spent hours talking about dreams, fears, parenting, the feeling of being turned away by the world, and how to look back at the world with kindness. They got married. And then had children. A man with no arms, no legs, carried his child with his shoulders, pushed the stroller with his chin, and kissed his wife with nothing but gratitude. Someone once asked him, "Don't you feel it's unfair that you can't do the things other fathers can?" Nick just smiled. "I don't need to be like anyone else. I just need to be the kind of father my child can trust and love." Life without limbs grew. But Nick never turned it into a personal brand. He built a team of people who had once stood on the edge, those who had doubted themselves, who had thought of ending it all, who had experienced things society would rather not look at. He brought them into the light, not to say, "Everything will be okay," but to remind them, "You are not alone." Nick visited prisons, where people had been cast out by society. He went to cancer hospitals, where laughter fades faster than anywhere else. He went to struggling schools, where many kids had never been told they mattered. And then, one day, he sat across from a boy who had lost both parents in war. The boy didn't say much. He just handed Nick a piece of paper, shaky handwriting across the page. "I have nothing left to believe in. But I saw you, and now I think, maybe I can start over." Nick didn't cry. But after the boy walked away, he bowed his head for a long, long time. Because he understood, all the years of pain, all the nights he had asked, "Why me?" all the scars he carried, finally had an answer. He didn't have hands to hold a microphone. But he had a voice. He didn't have legs to stand. But he had a foundation stronger than anything else. The truth of who he was. Because it was those very things that allowed him to truly touch the hearts of others. He was once the child rejected by schools, mocked by classmates, and pitted by society. But today, he's a global speaker. A husband. A father. The founder of an organization that helps millions discover their own worth. And most importantly, he is no longer a victim of his own life. He is the one who tells it, with courage. But Nick doesn't want to be celebrated as a legend. Every time someone calls him a living miracle, he simply smiles and says, "I'm no better than anyone. I'm just living proof that when you have nothing left, you still have a choice, to rise or to stay down." Unlike fairy tales, Nick's journey doesn't end with a happily ever after. He still struggles every day. Still faces stares of judgment. Still has moments when he feels helpless. But the biggest difference is, he no longer fights alone. Every story he tells is a spark. Every talk is a seed. Every act of kindness and authenticity is a quiet message. "I'm not perfect. But I'm still here. And so can you be." So now, you're sitting there, maybe not physically disabled. But are there parts of your soul that feel frozen, suffocated by fear, by the past, by things you're too afraid to say out loud? If so, remember this. You don't have to wait until everything is perfect. You don't have to be like anyone else. You just have to start. From exactly where you are. With exactly who you are. Because it's not, no arms, no legs, that limits us most. It's the belief that we can't change, that's the greatest prison of all. Nick didn't have easy choices. But he chose to live. And that made all the difference.